Hey there guys, how is everybody doing? This is Rob of Rule of Two Review and welcome back. So today's topic is super exciting and it should be a lot of fun to discuss, and it actually comes from one of you guys. This was a user question. A lot of you guys know every once in a while I put the call out on Twitter and Facebook for you guys to ask me questions or give me topic suggestions, and that's kind of what I felt like doing tonight randomly. Just one topic from one person and making a video around that. And I do usually choose these from Twitter because I'm so much more active on Twitter. You can even see the post right here. But I actually got a really good question from Facebook, from one of the people who follow the Facebook page. So I decided to go with this topic because it's also very, very relevant and it relates to a video I made just a couple of days ago. So of course, thank you to all the people who responded and asked me questions and gave me topic ideas on Twitter and on Facebook. I super appreciate it. Of course, if you want to be a part of the conversations and the user questions, and when I do my larger Q&As, you are invited to follow me on Twitter or Facebook. I am super active on Twitter, but of course I do use both of those places, and you know, today's a great example because the question I picked did come from Facebook. So let's go ahead and jump into this question so I can dive deep into this topic because, like I said, it's a pretty good one. So the Facebook question I'm answering today comes to us from Felix Borge, if I'm saying that right, Borge or Borge. Could be Borg, who knows? Either way, great question. Thank you so much, Felix, for asking. And this is what Felix asked me. Hey Rob, I have a question. Why is it so hard to talk about the new generation as the one started by Nintendo with the Nintendo Switch, and not so hard to do so when considering Sony or Microsoft launching new hardware in the future? Especially when Nintendo products clearly define a generation because their products are so unique, whereas Sony and Microsoft only add more power to their systems, making a lot of games a blur between generations. Keep up the good work. Awesome question, Felix. Again, thank you so much for that. I did my best to kind of make it out as well as I could, and ultimately, I think we can all pretty much get to the idea of what you're discussing. You're talking about the generations, how they're defined, the fact that Nintendo released the Switch, what is effectively their 9th generation console, just recently, and yet still there's conversation about the next generation coming with Sony and Microsoft's next console, and you feel like those ideas maybe don't necessarily fall in line with each other, and for good reason. I absolutely understand it. It is a messy state I think we find ourselves in the gaming industry only when trying to define the generations. I mean, I don't want to say as a whole we're in like a messy state. It's not like it's a huge deal, the idea of what we're talking about, but it is interesting. I think it carries some weight, and I think a lot of us care about this. So here's what's interesting, and I alluded to this a little bit ago. This question very much, I think, is building off of the conversation I had a couple of days ago in the video that I made discussing these rumors about the PlayStation 5. And I don't 100% know, Felix, if maybe you were inspired to ask me that question based on the video I made, because I referred to a lot of next generation PlayStation 5 stuff, and you know, PlayStation might start the next generation with the PS5, and then a lot of people discussed in the comments about Nintendo starting the generation with the Switch and all of these things. And it's interesting because all sides of this conversation, I think, have merit. Like, whatever side you kind of fall on here, I think has value and is right from its own perspective, from its own point of view. And so maybe because you saw my video and wanted to jump in that conversation, you were inspired, or maybe just because you're seeing this conversation in general, and so many people talk about the next generation with the next PlayStation and Xbox, and you're sitting here wondering, well, what about the Switch? Isn't that the next generation? And so to dive deeper here and try to really tackle the topic at hand here and what I think you're trying to get at, it's tricky because I've actually tried to envision what angles I wanted to come at this conversation from, and there are so many angles in my mind that it was hard for me to really decide how I wanted to start the topic. So I think that we'll start with the idea of the PlayStation 5, because that's the last video that I made, or the last conversation I had, that I think relates to this. And so when I made that video, I kept referring to Sony basically kickstarting what would be the next generation if the PlayStation 5 came out as soon as we're thinking, and if it is the first of the next consoles to be released. And I gotta tell you, I really still stand by that. I stand by the phrasing I used. And again, in my video, a lot of people tried to pick apart the idea, not in a mean way, but basically stating, well, but, you know, the Switch. It's all about the Switch. It already came out. It's Nintendo's 9th generation console. That's the next generation. It already started. So that wouldn't be what Sony is doing. And I definitely understand that. And I mean, you know me, I love the Switch, my favorite console. Nintendo is my favorite company. I don't think the PlayStation 5 has a chance at being a better piece of hardware and a piece of gaming hardware than the Switch. However, I still think I stand by how I phrase that with the PlayStation 5 maybe starting the next generation. And I think that the key thing to note that a lot of people maybe didn't pick up on in that video is I never referred to the PlayStation 5 as Sony starting the 9th generation. I only ever used the words next generation. And kind of by default, the idea of the next generation has nothing to do with the sequence. It has nothing to do with what number or what other label we're actually giving this generation we're talking about. It literally just means sequentially, not sequentially, I shouldn't say that, but it means the next in line from what already existed. And I do feel like the next PlayStation and or Xbox will probably be starting a new generation of consoles and hardware. And that the whole industry will make a shift at that time because of it. And that is, in my opinion, even as the biggest Nintendo fan, different than what Nintendo did by releasing the Switch. Even though I agree, the Switch is Nintendo's 9th generation machine. But I think the conversation gets a little bit trickier because, to me, starting the next generation and the Switch being the 9th generation don't actually have to be the same thing. And I know that we all want to put them into the same boat because traditionally, throughout the last couple of console jumps, we've looked at things that way. But I feel like this generation specifically, and when I say generation here, I mean this period of time, not like the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 generation. I mean the period of time that we're in right now in the industry. I feel like it kind of just makes it a different situation. To bring it back a little bit and try to make it a little bit more simpler before I go too off the rails with this topic, because like I said, I have 1,000 thoughts and angles to come at this conversation from. It's almost overwhelming. But at the end of the day, like I said, I absolutely acknowledge that the Switch is a 9th generation console, but it's this current generation we're in that changes everything to me, because this is the first generation in a long time, at least since we've had all 3 of the current players in the market, where things have skewed in so many different directions and everyone is just kind of all over the place. It's almost like everyone is sort of doing their own thing or has their own different ideas. And this generation, again, being a period in time, not a number generation, I think really doesn't have much of an identity. When we look at the past couple of generations where Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo were the 3 main key players, if we look at what happened, all 3 of them moved in tandem. They made relatively similar and close jumps from one generation to the next. The Xbox, GameCube, and PlayStation 2 all launched within a year of each other. They lasted a handful of years, and then within the same within the same 1-year gap, the PlayStation 3, the Wii, and the 360 all launched. I mean, it was 2005 and 2006 that all 3 of those consoles launched, basically moving at the same time from what was the 6th generation into the 7th generation. And the same thing happened again when we went from the 7th generation into what started the 8th generation, the Wii U, which definitely was an 8th generation machine, and Nintendo's 8th generation console came out in 2012, you know, the successor to the then Wii, and it was only the following year, the following November, 1 exact calendar year later, that we got the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4. And so there we go. The 8th generation started in that 2012 and 2013 timeline. So you've got literally from 6th gen into 7th gen into 8th gen, all 3 of these players moving at the same time. And to me, it was very easy for us to start labeling those as their own kind of cohesive generations. And it made sense. It was the right thing to do for us to look at each one of those as a 6th, 7th, 8th gen and lump it all together. But now here we are in 2018. The Wii U launched, kickstarting the 8th generation 6 years ago in 2012. The PlayStation 4 and Xbox One launched almost 5 years ago in late 2013. But a lot has happened in this generation, hasn't it? For example, Nintendo's 8th generation console, the Wii U, which I love. You guys know, every time I bring up the Wii U, I will state myself as a staunch Wii U supporter even to this day. So I'm not dogging the console. However, it failed, and it is now sadly dead. It is a dead console. So in this short span of time, the Wii U has gone away, and Nintendo has replaced it with a brand new piece of hardware. And also, Sony and Microsoft have released, for the first time ever, mid-generation refreshes, actual technical hardware upgrades of their current consoles, but they also did that without actually moving to next-generation hardware. It's a PS4 Pro, but it's still a PS4, and it's an Xbox One X, but it's still an Xbox One. So they haven't moved on to the new actual iterations of their respective brands. They're still in their 8th generation machines. Nintendo very much has moved to Nintendo's 9th generation machine with the Switch. That is absolutely true. However, I think that when we look at the industry as a whole, we haven't, if we want to keep ourselves kind of restricted to these labels of generation, 7th gen, 8th gen, 9th gen, 6th gen, whatever, if we keep ourselves restricted to those labels, which does make sense for this conversation to do so, the rest of the industry around Nintendo has not moved on. And that's not a good or a bad thing. I think that that's completely fine. I'm not saying, oh, good for Nintendo for moving on soon, or good for Sony and Microsoft for sticking it out, and bad on Nintendo or whatever. There's no, like, favoritism there. It's really just a factual observation. Nintendo had a business decision, a business reason to move on from their 8th gen machine very, very quickly and move to their 9th gen machine. And it obviously was a very good business decision because the Wii U failed, and the Switch is freaking devastating the planet with so many great sales and so many great games. So they made the right call for sure. But with Sony and Microsoft, 2/3 of the industry as a whole, as far as manufacturers, still rocking their 8th generation machines and not yet a real concrete sign of the next generation of their next hardware, I feel like that means that while Nintendo's in the 9th gen, I think the industry is still in the same generation that it already was before. And I base that more on, going back to this idea, the period in time we're in. I think that I'm looking at generations right now more as a period of time and no longer as what sequence in your release of hardware are you in, you know? Like, Sony is in this, you know, they're on their whatever 5th console, 4th, well, obviously 4th, PS4. So Sony's on their 4th console, Microsoft's on their 3rd console, Nintendo's on their whatever 7th console, quick math, I don't know, their 6th or 7th console that they've made, but the industry is considered in the 8th generation because of the stuff that existed before the 8-bit era with the NES. And so, at this point, with so much happening, Nintendo moves to 9th gen, Sony and Microsoft stay 8th gen, but then they also upgrade their hardware, rumors of their next hardware coming sometime after that. It's like, I think the walls and the barriers that define number generations, 6th gen, 7th gen, 8th gen, 9th gen, and so on, I kind of think that this 8th generation has sort of broken that. Long story short, or long story not short, I should say, because obviously I have a lot to say here, but I think that's one of the main things that I think about when I think about answering your question here, Felix, is I think the 8th generation has sort of broken the idea of the number generation. So, what that means, to me, in my opinion, is that this definition of the Switch being the 9th generation console, to me, doesn't mean that we're in the next generation. I think the next generation will begin when the next uber powerful hardware shows up, not because I'm a power junkie, but because the huge shifts in power, not minor shifts in power like to PS4 Pro and Xbox One X, huge shifts in power like to a PS5, to an Xbox 2, to a Switch 2, whatever comes after this, those huge shifts in power at this point, I think are what define the generations and separate gaps in time, because at that point, the industry and the technology of the industry moves along with it. The Switch coming out now has not shifted really the development of video games and has not changed the way video game developers are tapping into the power of the hardware. I mean, they're making great games for an amazing console that I just love. I mean, it's one of the best consoles ever made. This is not a slight on the Switch by any respect, guys. So I don't want any fellow Switch fans to start getting all crazy and defensive. This isn't a slight, it's just a fact. This didn't move the industry forward technology-wise. But when we get to the PlayStation 5, if that's the next console out in 2019 or 2020 or whatever, and it somehow proves to be this massive leap in capability and power and graphics and artificial intelligence and the scope and size of worlds and online networks that we would expect it to be, that would trounce what the Switch would be capable of, to me, I also expect Microsoft to do the same thing, because I do still think that while Nintendo isn't moving in tandem with them, that Sony and Microsoft are moving in tandem. We've only seen evidence that, to me, suggests if Sony comes out with the PlayStation 5, Microsoft is coming out with their next Xbox within the next year. It's just going to happen. And so those two guys collectively, and I hate to say it, but it is a lot of this based on power, those two guys collectively, I think, will shift the industry into its next form. You know, think of it, Frieza. Oh, I'm moving into my next form. You haven't seen my final form. I need a PS5 and an Xbox 2 to do that, I guess. And so I feel like that is when the industry is going to start to morph and move itself forward. And let's not, again, I'm not trying to count Nintendo out here, because as I stated in that video about the PlayStation 5, if and when that happens, if and when a PlayStation 5 and or a next Xbox comes out and then the whole industry starts to shift, I absolutely think Nintendo will have an answer at that time as well. I think that they will find a way to make their own leap and their own response to that. Whether it's just a more powerful upgrade to the Switch, or if it's another couple years down the road, maybe they end up just releasing their straight-up successor to the Switch, whatever that thing turns out to be. And suddenly, they've made their next significant jump into the next idea, the next technology, the next chipsets, the next power. And for Nintendo, their next quirky, innovative, crazy idea and unique controllers, because that's also how they innovate, which kind of goes to something you said in your question, Felix, about, I have to read it here, especially when Nintendo products clearly define generations, you say, because their products are so unique. Here's the thing. I agree with you that Nintendo makes the most unique products, absolutely, and I think they are moving the industry forward in more interesting ways than just power and graphics to me. However, I think that stance, even though I share a lot of it with you, is a little bit more of like the Nintendo fanboy bias coming into that. Think you're basically saying here, and I'm not dogging on you for this, man, but what I think you're saying is you like Nintendo products more, you think they're cooler and neater and more fun, and so you think that their uniqueness defines the next generation. And personally, even though I'm on that side of the fence with you, I don't think that that's what defines moving the generations and the industry forward, at least by itself. I think it's a combination of everything. I think we need advancing power and capability out of our machines, and we also need advancing ideas and quirky ideas and cool controllers, because, hey, I'm a guy who loves the Wii Remote. I'm the only guy on the planet who loves the frickin' Wii U gamepad, and I love the Joy-Cons and the portability of the Switch. So that stuff does matter, and I think it does shift the industry forward. But to end this extremely long answer, I didn't realize I would even talk this long about this stuff, but you guys know me, this is what I do. I talk forever about stuff. The point is, to end this conversation, ultimately, I think that this is really, really where we are. I think that innovative ideas moves the industry forward. I think that new power graphics and chipsets obviously moves the industry forward. Nintendo's 9th generation machine releasing in the middle of the 8th generation, to me, isn't the same as starting the next generation. It's Nintendo's new generation, but personally, and this is, again, only my opinion, I see a different definition of a next generation. I think it's going to start when the industry and at least more than half of the 3 console manufacturers move into their next hardware. Again, Nintendo is 1/3 of the console manufacturers. The other 2/3 are still in their 8th generation iterations. So I feel like the industry as a whole is still kind of there. Nintendo took an amazing and very successful sidestep to do a different thing and jump ahead a little bit and do some of that stuff. But again, the industry hasn't changed its game development or the technology it's making its games on because of the Switch, as great as it is. But I think that might happen in the next couple of years based on what happens with PS5, Xbox 2, and like I said, depending on how long it takes for this stuff to happen, Nintendo themselves will probably also be coming out with new hardware. Like I said, a Switch Mini, a Switch Pro, an upgraded Switch, a Switch 2, or their next thing that might not even be called the Switch, whatever it is. Like, it's not like Nintendo isn't a part of this race and a part of the game that all these companies are playing. I just personally see that Nintendo's 9th generation machine didn't shift us into the next generation. I think that's a couple years down the road, and I'm predicting that Sony or Microsoft, probably Sony, are going to be the ones to really kick us into that next step. So anyway, I think there'll be a lot of conversation here. I would anticipate maybe a lot of people, because I know you guys are all Nintendo fans just like me, I feel like a lot of people might not like the fact that I'm not defining the next generation by the Nintendo Switch. And I get it, you know, as Nintendo fans, we want to think Nintendo was the forebearers of the 9th generation with the Switch. And while they are in the sense of the number 9, I don't think they are in the sense of the industry. But I also don't think it's a negative. I'm not trying to paint a bad picture here, and I think that most of you guys will be able to see that, I hope. So I am really curious to see what you guys think about my long-winded answer to Felix's awesome question here. A lot of different ideas. This was, like I said, hard for me to know how I wanted to tackle this conversation. And I hope I didn't make it too weird or confusing sounding, but it sure was fun, man. I love talking about this stuff. Give me a crazy, thick, juicy topic, and I just want to dissect it and just tear it apart and just get really deep into it. And I had a lot of fun answering this question. So like I said, Felix, my man, thank you so much for the question. Very insightful, very good question. A perfect sequel to my PS5 video from a couple of days ago, because the conversations, I think, really kind of relate to each other in a lot of ways. So I'm going to shut up now and just let you guys talk. I really want to hear what you have to say. I'm prepared for some dislikes. I'm prepared for people to be upset with my opinion here. That's okay. I get it. We all love Nintendo. We all love gaming and all these companies, so we get very passionate about it for sure. So discuss this fun stuff about the generation situation below. I can't wait to hear what you guys have to say. That is it for me today. Thank you, as always, for tuning in, guys. This is Rob of Ro2R Review, and I'll catch you next time on another video.